Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to AJ507 Ethics in Criminal Justice. My name is Tony Farrar, and of course, I am your instructor for this semester. So, this week's lecture is going to cover Chapter 5, where we're going to take a look at the police role in society. A lot of information to cover. I'm going to try to fit it into those two 30-minute segments. So, let's go ahead and jump right in because, again, just a lot of stuff that we need to kind of go over. Learning objectives, we're going to describe the two different missions of law enforcement, compare the current trends of policing to past historical time, provide the justification for police power and the basic ethical standards that derive from this justification, identify the differences between formal ethics of law enforcement and the values of police subculture, and then describe some recent research findings on police culture, if you will. So a tsunami of scrutiny has battered law enforcement officers over the past few years. Most recently, the George Floyd killing in Minneapolis has resulted in demands for more reform. And I put it, typically it says reform, but there has been a lot of reform, so there needs to be more. So that's kind of why I threw that in there, okay? Now, along with that, the Michael Brown shooting in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014, the death of Freddie Gray in 2015 in Baltimore, Maryland, triggered basically a lot of negative media attention. And there have been some other incidents as well. And the Department of Justice basically investigating issues relating to law enforcement and use of force. And, there are allegations that officers use deadly force against minority men disproportionately, and that, and more pervasively, they also might discriminate against minorities, policing differently than those that might be white. And that's kind of been the theme of some intense scrutiny over, the last several years, probably since about 2014. Now, with that, police officers have felt attacked and misunderstood and wrongfully blamed and unappreciated. Harsh scrutiny is or has been directed at police actions, especially as of late. There is, however, a reason for such scrutiny sometimes, because law enforcement represents, and we'll use the quote here, the thin blue line, if you will. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that kind of stands for and what some people think it might stand for. But anyway, it's kind of the line between disorder and order. That's one way of looking at it, okay? They are also the personification of the power of the state. So we have to kind of understand that, right? Because realistically, no other criminal justice professional comes under as much constant and public scrutiny, than law enforcement, right? And no other criminal justice professional basically has as much power and authority over the citizenry. So, when you kind of continue with that, police have the choice to arrest or not, to mediate or to charge, in decisions to use deadly force. They even hold the power of life and death in some circumstances. And if such power were used fairly, legally, and ethically, they would be considered our protectors. If such power is used abusively or arbitrarily, or in other ways that are deemed to be corrupt, then they become oppression, right? Now, in non-democratic countries, keep in mind that the police are feared because they act with what we call impunity to maintain, those in power. In some areas of whether it's Colombia, Mexico, South America, etc., police are viewed as corrupted by the drug cartels. In other parts of the world, they're viewed as kind of owned by the rich and the famous. So again, no other criminal justice professional comes under as much constant and public scrutiny, but no other criminal justice professional has as much unrestrained, and I put sort of, power and authority. I mean, think about it. Would you go into your doctor's office, or if you're about ready to go into surgery, are you going to tell the surgeon how to do their job? The answer to that is going to be probably not. But there are a lot of individuals that think that they know how law enforcement should be. So there really is two sides to this issue. So we have to at least be open enough to understand or think about and consider both sides. As I said a moment ago, police have the choice to arrest or not to arrest, to mediate or charge, and unfortunately, if it's needed, to use deadly force. And if such power is used fairly, legally, ethically, we say they're the protectors. But if it's abusive, arbitrary, or it's deemed to be corrupt, then they become oppressors. Okay, so a lot of information kind of thrown at you right at the introduction here. Now, law enforcement in the United States is very decentralized. And because of this, it is difficult to get an accurate count of exactly how many law enforcement officers there really are. Now, one recent federal report notes that sources may vary, but there were between 687,657 and 750,340 sworn officers. Those are the ones that have powers of arrest, carry a firearm, etc. And between 203,632 and 325,714 non-sworn law enforcement employees back in 2012. Now, of course, these numbers are different, especially, the textbook it's not out of date, but it's not yesterday's textbook. So keep in mind, this is data that we're looking at from 2012, and it really hasn't changed overall that much. Now, even though there are a few extremely large police departments like New York City, which has about 34,000 officers, most departments are very small, with about 48% having 10 officers or even less. Or it could be like the city of Carabel, which has one officer. Interesting, huh? Okay, but there are about 18,000 agencies of various sizes. And because of the large differences between departments, it is extremely difficult to have a conversation, a deep down conversation about certain aspects of policing in this country, because large departments are very different from small departments in informal culture, policies, even discipline systems. And you can even think of it, the suburban departments versus the rural. So like LAPD, San Francisco, these big, huge cities, right? Versus some place where there's just miles of nothing. So different styles, different things. Every city is a little bit different and is going to demand a little bit different of something from their law enforcement officers. So again, a lot to kind of think about. So unfortunately, when any agency is front page news because of ethical misconduct, that affects, the effects of such negative press basically impacts all of our agencies. It basically, in police talk, we talk about it giving the law enforcement profession a black eye, if you will, because it hurts everybody. And again, and I've said this before, the majority, being about 99%, if not a little bit more, of law enforcement officers are in it for the right reason. But I'll also be honest enough to tell you there are some that haven't been in it for the right reason and currently shouldn't be in it for any reason. So I want to make sure that we understand there are individuals that have done wrong things, bad things, and shouldn't be police officers, corrections officers, or any part of that criminal justice system whatsoever. And here's just kind of a quick look at the kind of ebb and flow of the number of law enforcement officers, say from about 2004 through 2019. Okay, so now we're going to talk about, hey, is it crime fighter or public servant? So, two different missions of law enforcement in a democracy can be identified as having quite different implications for decision making. Now, this does not, of course, mean to say that these missions are necessarily contradictory or even exclusive. It is important to note that the history and present day influence of different roles, okay, and there are different roles. And we'll look at some of those. So when you ask most people, what's the role of policing in society? Typically, the response is some version of, catch criminals, arrest people, keep us safe, and fight crime. Typically you kind of get that in there. Usually it's catch criminals and fight crime. But in reality, there are two missions of law enforcement in that democracy that we're talking about. And that would be crime fighting and public service. And you're probably going, wow, public service, really? Well, the answer to that is yes, public service. So crime fighting, as we kind of look at definitions, if you will, leads to a willingness to accept certain definitions and justifications of behavior. And public service would be those professionals who are paid by the public and whose jobs entail pursuing the public good, not necessarily their own good, right? So just kind of keep that in mind as we continue our discussion here. So if one views police as crime control agents, the presumption is that criminals, who are different from the rest of us, are police officers, are the soldiers in a war on crime. And this model, so if we're talking about, if we look at law enforcement as the crime control agents, then typically they're viewed, the officers are viewed as soldiers in a war on crime. And you've heard that before, and you've heard the phrase war on drugs probably. Now, this particular model is based on Herbert Packer's crime control model. And according to Packer, the crime control model operates under the following principles. So here's his crime fighting model. Repression of criminal conduct is the most important function. Failure of law enforcement means the breakdown of order. Criminal process is the positive guarantee or guarantor of social freedom. Efficacy is a top priority. Emphasis is on speed, but also finality. A conveyor belt is the model for this system, and there is a presumption of guilt. So this is Packer's crime fighting model, if you will. Now, police perception of their role as crime fighters will lead to certain decision in their use of force, their definition of duty, and their use of deception and coercion. Public perception of the police mission as primarily crime fighting leads to a willingness to accept certain definitions, again, and justifications of behavior. That drug addicts are unworthy of protection, that individuals who are maybe beaten by police must have deserved what they got, and that all defendants must be guilty, and so on. In most cases, police actions are rationalized or excused by the belief that people basically get what they deserve. So again, we're talking about Packer's, crime control model. Now, if one views the police as public servants, those presumptions are different and include the idea that criminals are not so different from us. In fact, they might be our sons or daughters. And as public servants, police officers serve all people, and we owe everyone the duty of civility or legality. And then finally, there is the idea that police officers have limited ability to affect crime rates one way or another, because crime is a kind of a complex social phenomenon, and crime can be complex, just so you know. So under Packer's due process model that we're going to look at, these following principles stand out in contrast, right, to the ones that we looked at in Packer's crime control. So here's the due process model. There is possibility for error. Finality is not a priority. There is insistence on prevention and elimination of mistakes. Efficiency is rejected if it means taking a shortcut. Protection of the process is as important as protection of those who are innocent. And the coercive power of the state is always subject to abuse. So again, kind of a conflict there, right? So, Packer's original model of due process that he contrasted with his crime control model is somewhat different from our description of the public service mission. Rather than just an emphasis on rights as in the due process model, under the public servant model proposed that you saw, law enforcement is perceived as kind of owned, if you will, by all the people. So service then becomes foremost. Okay, so you have some different, again, crime fighter, public servant. Now, a perception of the police officer as public servants implies a much more restrictive view of police and power. The utilitarian idea that the end, crime control, justifies almost any means, if you will, the ends justify the means, is rejected in favor of an approach that is more protective of due process and equal protection. So in the public service mission, law enforcement, above all, protects the right of every citizen. Now, before we kind of move on, think about it. It's a little deeper than you think. Should it be one model over the other, or can any of those models kind of maybe bleed together? Maybe a little bit from each. I don't know. It's just something for you to kind of think about as we keep talking. So the crime control model of policing, I'm going to go back and forth for a second, is related to, again, that war on crime type mentality, with police officers seen as the warriors, again, on the front lines. And, now, as we kind of sit right now, the current focus on moving perception of policing from what we call the warrior model to that of guardian. So there is the guardian. There's this focus. When you look at the president's, this was President Obama who did the 21st Century Task Force on Policing. Okay, and we'll talk more about that later on in a couple of different lectures. One of the big issues when they looked at different typologies of law enforcement officers, right, how they act, how they're viewed, perceived, etc., there was the warrior mentality and the guardian mentality. And in that report, that final report that came out, one of the main focuses was moving perception of law enforcement away from the warrior model and more towards that as the guardian model. And the guardian model sees the officer as primarily a protector of citizens, but also of democratic values. So the warrior is the go-getter, the arrestor, the fight crime, blah blah blah, which is still needed, right? But kind of moving that perception away from the warrior to the guardian. So again, current focus on moving perception of policing from warrior model to that of the guardian. And I gave you a couple of definitions. So the warrior approach views police as the soldiers, again, engaged in that battle. The emphasis is on making sure that they know it's dangerous, but there's an emphasis on danger and force. Whereas the guardian approach sees the officer as primarily protectors of the citizens and democratic values. Therefore, the focus is on values like service and protection. But you could probably see how maybe both of those might be appropriate in certain situations, right? Okay, so kind of moving on. And we're still talking about crime fighter or public servant. Now, many feel that law enforcement in this country have become militarized, if you will, even as crime has somewhat declined. And there's a phrase for that. It's called the kind of the militarization of police, okay? And we'll talk a little bit about that. Balco in 2013 describes the origins when he talks about police militarization. He describes the origins of the special weapons and tactics team, SWAT, the model in Los Angeles. And now, currently, there are thousands of such units, etc., in the United States that have conducted tens of thousands of raids and served search warrants, etc., hostage type issues each year. According to the ACLU, about 79% of these SWAT teams, they deploy SWAT teams for just search warrants, not on some of the higher level crimes, okay? And that's kind of one of the issues that Balco sees here, is that why do we need all these kind of army-looking men and women serving a search warrant? Shouldn't they be used for kidnappings and hostage negotiations and barricaded suspects and things like that? And here's a picture of the Inland Valley SWAT team that makes up Fontana, Rialto, and the city of Colton. Okay, so just kind of keeping along with that, making sure that we talk a little bit more about that. Another element, if you will, of police, militarization is the growing number of ex-military. And we'll talk about that, but he also focused on the dangers of the rise in the use of what we call no-knock warrants. And this is where you're going to go and make entry into a residence, an apartment, a building, etc., and you basically, because of the possibility of firearms and injury, etc., you get the judge to sign a no-knock warrant, which means that you basically don't have to announce yourself. And this there are some, there's a tactic that's necessary, but they can cause issues. And in these different types of warrants, etc., these units use military tactics, things like flashbang grenades and battering rams. They are dressed in black camouflage, or they're dressed in camouflage or black uniforms, often masked and heavily armed. But I hope you can at least see that, again, this is Balco that's talking about crime fighter versus public servant and how he views the militarization of police, but yet there is a need for some of this. So I at least want you to know that as we look at different aspects, okay? Because there are barricaded suspects, mass shootings, hostage takings, kidnappings, armed robberies, etc. So these crimes still exist. Thus, there is a need for these types of units. And as I said a moment ago, another element of the perceived militarization of police would be the growing number of ex-military, which many see as very good and some see as not so good. It's reported that 1 in 5 police officers have a military background, and about 20% are actually veterans. These individuals bring discipline and important skill sets to law enforcement. But again, under the militarization of police, they also bring the warrior mentality, okay, which can be good, and sometimes it maybe isn't good. So they're at least letting you see this. Again, crime fighter versus public servant. So kind of, finishing up our crime fighter versus public servant, Balco in 2014 explains officers today are socialized by their training and culture to be suspicious of citizens and be always on the lookout for danger. Well, yeah, that's part of their training. But is that something that maybe is overdone, if you will? And many disagree, but some would, some might agree with that. But again, he's bringing this information up for us to kind of think out. Balco was also one of the first to draw attention to what we call the 1033 program. And this is a program under which local law enforcement could and do receive military equipment that's no longer needed. So maybe high-powered rifles, M16s, certain types of launching devices, maybe even certain types of tear gas, armored vehicles, etc. And basically, the National Defense Authorization Act allows the Department of Defense to basically get rid of excess equipment to some of these law enforcement agencies that might need some type of equipment for their special weapons teams, etc. Okay, so that's a little bit of, again, talking about, as we go back, crime fighter versus public servant. And when I go back here and look at some of these, here you can see the different vehicles in the background there. Those are called Bearcats, and those are armored vehicles for rescues and safety of officers, etc. So again, just trying to give you the big picture on all this. Now we're going to switch gears and we're going to kind of take a look at the history of policing from public servant to, crime fighter. Okay, so we're going to kind of go through this as well. So well, you know what? Let me add one more quick thing in here. When it talks to, as it relates to the warrior mindset. In contrast to that warrior approach, and this just kind of popped in my head, again, is the guardian approach. There has been a growing national movement, again, towards that guardian model in policing. The warrior approach views police as soldiers, again, in the battle, with the emphasis of danger, and the guardian model, again, sees officers kind of as the protectors, and things like that. And there is now a greater focus on values, etc. So let's at least kind of keep that in mind. So the question then would be, as we kind of finish that up, what type of policing do we want? Do we want crime fighters or public servants? Those who value the crime fighter warrior role are more tolerant of police error in the use of force incidents and what we might call over-policing. And those who believe that the police should emphasize their public servant guardian role are much less tolerant of, any inappropriate use of power. Police officers too tend to perceive one role as dominant over the other, and this perception basically shapes their daily behavior. And these two models are better understood, again, if we take a little bit of kind of a history look at law enforcement, across the U.S. So let's do that and look at a little bit of history. And I'm not sure if I passed it, but back here, there was a slide that actually had, Well, maybe there wasn't. Okay, I must have missed it, because there's a couple of different surveys that I wanted you to take a look at, but we'll take a look at that as we kind of get going. Okay, so now let's talk about history. All right, so the early origins of law enforcement was a model of service, if you will. Police were involved in, social service activities. They ran soup kitchens, provided lodging and direction for homeless individuals and the indigent, and spread moral reform movements against, alcohol, cigarettes, etc. Now, of course, early law enforcement personnel were also involved in social control and employed utilitarian violence. And they basically acted as the force for, power holders, those, rich and powerful, etc. And also the political machine. Okay, so, that was kind of their role way back then. Now, early departments were marred by frequent, what we call graft, which would be bribery, etc., and other forms of corruption. And the power, toward police, the word here, professionalism, kind of started in the 20s, spurred by several factors, one of which was to improve the image of police as objective enforcers of the law rather than enforcers for, whoever happened to be in power. So objective meaning, here's the law, we're going to uphold the law without any interference from political figures, etc., versus, enforcing the law based on who's in office or who's in power. So in essence, kind of, there was actually a shift in loyalty, if you will. Now, part of this transformation involved the idea that police were crime fighters, professional soldiers, again, in the war on crime, a concept that, implies objectivity, professional expertise, and specialized training. And this role de-emphasized the social service role. It kind of took away from that social service role and ultimately led to, basically, police becoming, having a new role where they were proactive rather than simply reactive to public demands. So we're starting to see a little bit of change there. And this historical social service role of police, again, kind of, everything kind of comes around a little bit, was resurrected, if you will, in community policing, in that movement that reached the height of prevalence in the 1990s. And community policing involves having officers develop closer relationships with community leaders to help them solve some of the social problems that are believed to be affiliated with the development of disorder and crime. So by definition, a model of law enforcement that creates partnerships with the community and addresses basically those underlying problems rather than simply just enforcing the law. Okay, so there's more to it than, just the letter of the law, right? This is the violation, so there you go. There's a lot more to it, and that's part of that community policing model. And if you don't think it's prevalent, here's a couple of front pages of Police Chief Magazine that I still subscribe to. And you can even look at the dates. You have 2018, 2017, 2016. And on here, even though this was a hot topic back in the 90s, what do you see? Community police engagement, community police relations, police community relations, because that's really what a lot of the people are asking for. Okay, so this community policing thing is what it is. Okay, and then a couple of other things that kind of came in when we talk about policing, etc., would be things like the Patriot Act, because after 9/11, right? While some of the aspects of the community policing approach have been kind of institutionalized, etc., 9/11 led to kind of a retrenchment, if you will, in policing and a return to kind of some more traditional crime fighting elements, right? And that kind of led to things like the Patriot Act, where law enforcement basically has a little bit more freedom to do things. They're allowed to use some of the tools that are already available to them. It does update some of the laws. The laws reflect new technologies, but it increases penalties for those who commit terrorism and things like that. So again, these things are changing, right? The Patriot Act gave law enforcement at that time unprecedented ability to search, seize, detain, and eavesdrop in their pursuit of terrorists. And the law expanded wiretapping and electronic surveillance authority, and allowed nationwide jurisdiction for search warrants and other surveillance devices, all of course to deal with terrorism, etc. And not to go into it too much, but President Obama signed a 4-year sunset extension of the Patriot Act in 2011. Then it was again updated in 2015, sorry. So it expired in 11 and then it expired again in 2015. But there were 3 key provisions that were always still there: roving wiretaps, surveillance of lone wolf terror suspects, and then searching of business records. Again, these are things that, as different things happen, law enforcement shifts and changes. Okay, so we're going to go a little bit long because there still is a lot to cover. So I'm going to go just a little bit more and then we'll take our first break. So let's look quickly at the future of policing and what they call the Ferguson effect. So today, preventative policing, problem-solving policing, predictive policing, and intelligence-led policing, all different types, exist in a kind of complex mix of approaches and terminology. And we'll kind of take a look at some of these, right? So problem solving kind of arises naturally out of community-based policing, whereby neighborhood problems are identified and then they're dealt with, and there's a partnership between law enforcement and the community. So that's kind of the problem solving. They try to find the underlying issues that are creating a certain type of crime, if you will, and together in that partnership, they work to solve those underlying issues. Now, predictive policing focuses on sophisticated data gathering and analysis. It also uses geographic analysis to identify where criminal events are likely to occur based on where offenders have committed crimes in the past. So it's kind of like hotspot mapping, where they're taking data and finding out where are all these crimes happening and using an algorithm, if you will, to kind of predict where they might happen again. So these are all things that happened after 9/11. Intelligence-led policing is kind of a managerial philosophy where data analysis and intelligence are used to help make objective decisions designed to prevent crime. So it could be like CPTED, crime prevention through environmental design, right? Where they design certain, building structures, parking lots, etc., a certain way, extra lighting, cameras, all this other stuff to kind of help prevent crime. That's part of the intelligence-led philosophy, etc. So there's just a couple of different examples of different types of policing. Now, whether police continue to move forward towards the guardian model or, they stay warrior kind of remains to be seen. And I mentioned this earlier, the approach of the president's task force on 21st century policing was that police should acknowledge that the role of policing in the past and the present injustice, okay, and take steps to restore public trust and confidence. Because let's face it, we know And I can tell you, after 34 years in law enforcement and starting as an officer and retiring as a police chief, I know that policing ebbs and flows. There's good years in policing, and then there's not so good years, just like in a lot of different type careers. But since law enforcement is, kind of in the spotlight, they tend to be focused on a lot, and you have years where law enforcement tends to do a lot of good things, and they still do, and then you have some years where they need to change things. So here, part of the recommendation was, you know what, the role of policing in the past, and then some of the present things that are happening, we need to change some of that in order to restore public trust and confidence. And if you want to look at that final report, you can click on that link and it'll take you to the final report. Because civil suits, federal consent decrees, collaborative reform, etc., have led to departments keeping better use of force and stop and frisk records, etc., training in de-escalation, training in implicit bias, and community policing efforts. So kind of what we're saying here is that sometimes a lot of these negative things that have happened, the civil suits and the consent decrees where you have the government kind of overseeing a local agency, that has helped push law enforcement in a better direction to kind of clean up some of these organizations that may not be running as well as they need to. However, there is also some strong resistance to the theme that there is something wrong with law enforcement that needs to be fixed, or that the police are systemically biased. So again, and that's an opinion thing that we'll talk about on a different lecture. Okay, but again, I do want you to understand that the majority of policing, they're great folks. They get in it for the right reason, but there's also some that aren't so great, and they shouldn't be there, and they never should have been there in the first place. So we kind of know that already. Some also argue that the national scrutiny and criticism of law enforcement has led to such a strong anti-police kind of rhetoric that it has endangered police. Now, according to this view, the focus on a few bad apples has kind of fueled the anti-police rhetoric again and created public hostility, up to and including ambushing law enforcement officers. And there's a little bit more of those details in your textbook. And if you were to look at line of duty deaths in law enforcement right now, it has never been so high. So there is some merit to what is being said. And, we talk here, 2020 was one of the deadliest years for law enforcement officers on record. And it kind of gives you a little bit of information here. And then another current discussion, and I'll finish with this for part one, of concern is what we call the Ferguson or the YouTube effect, or even, depolicing effect that some individuals might call it. Now, and what that kind of means is that there is just so much hype and negativity towards law enforcement, and everything is just being questioned to the nth degree, that, again, that scrutiny, hostility, etc., have basically made officers so demoralized that they have in fact reduced their self-initiated activity and no longer engage in proactive policing, such as, looking for suspicious persons on the street, etc. And this, some have said, has led to spikes in crime and even homicide. And in some cities, this is actually a fact. And in some cities, it is not. But overall, we'll just kind of leave it at that. So there is a factual basis for this. Think about it. If you're questioned about everything that you do, how motivated are you to do it? But yet, we pay you as citizens, right? I'm a citizen now. I was before, but I'm retired. So I pay our local law enforcement, I pay taxes for them to go out and find the bad people, within the confines of the law. But that means stopping people that look suspicious, like they're involved in criminal activity. But if you're so worried about getting in trouble, etc., you're not going to do it. And that's kind of what they're talking about when you talk about the Ferguson effect or YouTube effect, meaning that you're going to be on YouTube next week. Okay, so interestingly enough, at the bottom of this slide right here, there's a survey from the Pew Research Center, and these are really cool surveys that this one addresses what police think about their jobs. And it's super interesting. So I would suggest maybe taking a moment and doing that. And again, when you look at the different things that have happened, different, civil disturbances based on, use of force, whether you believe it was valid or not valid, etc., this is what you have taking place. So you've got, Baltimore, you have Ferguson, Missouri, you have St. Louis. All of these are, again, things that law enforcement really needs to kind of bounce back from, and they typically do, but sometimes it's a long road. So okay, so we're right about the 45-minute mark, a little bit over, but we're going to take our first break because we really need the time, and then we'll come back for part 2.